Nathaniel Whitmore slammed his palm against the polished oak desk, his jaw clenched tight as his father's words echoed in his ears. "You have no choice, Nathaniel. The board is pressuring me, and this marriage is the only way to secure the merger." "A forced marriage," Nathaniel spat, his blue eyes flashing with fury. "In what century do you think we're living, Dad?" His father, Richard Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, met his son's glare with a cold, unwavering expression. "You're the CEO now, Nathaniel. This isn't just about you. Whitmore Enterprises is at risk, and the only way to secure the deal with the Kensington Group is if you marry Margaret Kensington's granddaughter." "The wedding is in a week." Nathaniel's head spun. He had built his reputation as a ruthless, calculated businessman, not as some pawn in a corporate marriage scheme. The idea of marrying a woman he had never met was absurd. "I won't do it," he growled. "You will," Richard said calmly, standing from his chair, "or you'll lose everything you've worked for. Walk away and the company goes down with you." Nathaniel exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. He had spent the last decade proving himself, ensuring Whitmore Enterprises remained at the top of the business world. Walking away wasn't an option. "Who is she?" he finally asked, his voice tight. "Serena Kensington," Richard said, sliding a file across the desk. "She's a school teacher, Margaret Kensington's only granddaughter. She has no interest in business, which means she won't interfere with your work. This is purely a formality." "A school teacher," Nathaniel frowned, flipping open the file. A photograph was clipped to the first page. She had long, dark brown hair that cascaded over her shoulders, deep hazel eyes, and a soft, hesitant smile. She was beautiful, but that didn't change the fact that she was a stranger. Nathaniel closed the file with a snap. "Set up the meeting," he muttered. Serena Kensington sat stiffly across from Nathaniel Whitmore, her hands clasped in her lap. She had expected their first meeting to be uncomfortable, but she hadn't anticipated the sheer intensity of the man sitting before her. Nathaniel was devastatingly handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. But his posture was rigid, his expression unreadable. "I assume you hate this idea as much as I do," he said, breaking the silence. Serena exhaled, nodding. "I never expected my grandmother to arrange my marriage like this. But she's adamant that this is what's best for our family." Nathaniel's fingers tapped against the table. "And you're just going along with it." Serena's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple. My grandmother has done everything for me. If marrying you means securing her legacy, I can't just say no." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. "So you're willing to marry a stranger?" Serena lifted her chin. "Are you?" A smirk tugged at the corner of Nathaniel's lips. "I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Serena swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She had expected him to be cold and detached, but there was something else beneath his hardened exterior, a quiet storm brewing behind those blue eyes. "We don't have to make this more painful than it already is," she said. "Let's set some ground rules. We can be civil. We don't have to pretend to be in love, but we should at least try to make this work." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, regarding her with a calculating gaze. "Fine. But don't expect me to play the doting husband." Serena forced a smile. "Trust me, I won't." The wedding day arrived faster than Serena could process. She stood in front of the full-length mirror, her heart pounding as she smoothed down the fabric of her ivory gown. The dress was breathtaking, an off-the-shoulder masterpiece that clung to her curves before flowing into a delicate train. But despite the beauty of the gown, the weight of reality settled heavily on her shoulders. In just an hour, she would be walking down the aisle toward a man she barely knew. A soft knock sounded at the door. Her grandmother, Margaret Kensington, stepped inside, her sharp eyes softening as she took in Serena's expression. "You look beautiful, darling," Margaret said, squeezing her hand. Serena swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Grandmother." Are you sure this is the right thing? Margaret's expression turned serious. I know this isn't how you imagined your wedding day, but Nathaniel is a good man, even if he doesn't know it yet. And this marriage will protect everything we've built. Serena closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the one she expected. It's time, Margaret whispered. Nathaniel stood at the altar, his jaw tight as he watched Serena walk toward him. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, he felt his chest tighten. She was stunning, utterly breathtaking. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant updo, a few loose strands framing her delicate features. The moment their eyes met, something shifted inside him. She looked nervous. Of course she was. This wasn't a fairy tale wedding, it was a business transaction. And yet, as she reached him, he couldn't deny the strange pull he felt toward her. The ceremony passed in a blur. Vows were exchanged, rings were slipped onto fingers, and before Nathaniel could fully process it, the officiant was saying the words that sealed their fates. You may now kiss the bride. Nathaniel hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. He placed a hand on the small of Serena's back and leaned in, pressing his lips softly against hers. He had expected the kiss to be cold, emotionless, a mere formality. But the moment their lips touched, a spark shot through him, sharp and electric. Serena inhaled sharply, her fingers trembling against his chest. When he pulled away, his pulse was racing. Something was happening, something unexpected. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Nathaniel wasn't entirely sure if he wanted to fight it. The reception was a whirlwind of flashing cameras, murmured congratulations, and an endless stream of guests eager to shake hands with the newlyweds. Serena's fingers curled around the stem of a champagne flute, her grip tight enough that she feared it might shatter. She had barely processed the ceremony, let alone the reality of what came next. Nathaniel stood beside her, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and smiled at all the right moments. But there was a distance in his eyes, something carefully concealed behind the mask of a man who had spent his life perfecting control. A well-dressed older woman leaned in, her voice sweet yet calculated as she addressed Serena. My dear, you must tell us, how did you and Nathaniel meet? Was it love at first sight? Serena's throat tightened. She hadn't prepared for this question. Nathaniel's response was seamless, his voice smooth as he answered before she could stumble. It was unexpected, he said, glancing at Serena with an expression so unreadable it sent a shiver down her spine. But sometimes the best things in life are. The woman beamed, seemingly satisfied with the vague answer, and Serena forced a polite smile, though her stomach twisted. As the evening dragged on, Serena felt the weight of expectation pressing heavier upon her. Every look, every whispered conversation, every scrutinizing gaze reminded her that this was more than a marriage. It was a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated performance. When Nathaniel finally excused them from the last of their obligatory conversations, Serena exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. But relief was short-lived. Because now there were no more distractions. Now they were alone. The penthouse suite was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city skyline, casting a golden glow over the sleek furnishings. A fireplace flickered in the corner, and an open bottle of champagne sat waiting on a glass table, 2 crystal flutes beside it. Serena hesitated near the entrance, her fingers grazing the fabric of her gown. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. Nathaniel shrugged off his jacket, draping it over the back of a chair before finally turning to face her. His gaze was unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes sent a rush of warmth through her. She searched for something to say, something that would break the tension, but her mind betrayed her. Nathaniel was the first to speak. You don't have to be nervous. Serena's chin lifted slightly, her pulse quickening. I'm not nervous, she said, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. He took a slow step closer, and though his expression remained controlled, something flickered beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite decipher. "We don't have to force anything tonight," he continued, his voice softer now. "This marriage may have been arranged, but I won't make you do anything you don't want to do." His words caught her off guard. She had expected cold detachment, indifference even. But this was different. For the first time since the ceremony, she allowed herself to truly look at him. The sharp angles of his face, the way his dress shirt stretched across his broad shoulders, the quiet intensity in his gaze, it was overwhelming in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had been so focused on the circumstances of their marriage that she hadn't considered the man himself. The way his presence filled the room, the way his voice sent an unbidden warmth through her skin. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "I appreciate that." Nathaniel nodded, but he didn't move away. The silence between them shifted, no longer uncomfortable, but charged with something else entirely. Serena's pulse thrummed in her ears as she turned toward the window, trying to steady herself. The city stretched out before her, lights flickering like stars against the darkness. She had spent her whole life in controlled, predictable surroundings, teaching, caring for her grandmother, living a quiet, steady existence, and now she was here, married to a man she barely knew. Nathaniel's voice broke through her thoughts. "You can take the bedroom, I'll stay out here." She turned back to him, surprised by the offer. "You don't have to do that," she said. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "I think it's best for tonight." Serena nodded slowly. "Okay." She hesitated for a moment longer before finally stepping toward the bedroom, but just as she reached the doorway, she glanced back at him. He stood by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flames, lost in thought. Something about the sight made her chest tighten. Without thinking, she spoke. "Good night, Nathaniel." He looked up, and for the first time that evening, his expression softened. "Good night, Serena." And as she closed the door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had shifted, something neither of them had expected. Nathaniel woke with a start, the dim light of dawn filtering through the penthouse windows. He sat up, running a hand through his hair as he glanced toward the bedroom door. It was still closed. Serena had stayed in there all night. He exhaled, trying to shake off the unfamiliar weight in his chest. He had expected last night to be nothing more than an uncomfortable necessity, a transaction to seal a business deal. But something had shifted the moment he kissed her at the altar. He couldn't stop thinking about it, the way her breath had hitched, the way her fingers had trembled against him before she caught herself. Nathaniel wasn't a man who dwelled on emotions. He dealt in logic, in strategy, and yet last night had left him restless in a way he didn't know how to explain. The bedroom door creaked open and Serena stepped out, her hair slightly tousled. She wore a simple, oversized sweater that draped over her frame, her bare legs just visible beneath the hem. Nathaniel forced himself to look away, focusing on pouring a cup of coffee. She hesitated near the entrance, her expression uncertain. He gestured toward the counter. "There's coffee if you want some," she nodded, moving toward him with careful steps. He watched as she poured herself a cup, her fingers curling around the warm ceramic. An uneasy silence settled between them. Serena finally broke it. "So, what happens now?" Nathaniel leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "We make it believable." She looked up at him, her hazel eyes searching. "Believable? The press is watching. The board is watching. We don't have the luxury of figuring this out privately." She exhaled, setting her coffee down. "So we pretend." He nodded. She studied him for a long moment. "How far does this go?" Nathaniel hesitated. "Public appearances, interviews if necessary. We don't have to be in love, but we have to look like we could be." Her gaze didn't waver. "And behind closed doors?" Something inside him tightened at the question. "That's up to us," he said finally. Serena didn't answer right away. She took a slow sip of her coffee, as if thinking carefully before speaking. I don't want to be just another deal you're managing, Nathaniel. Her words landed heavier than he expected. I'm not asking you to be, he said. She studied him for a moment longer before nodding. Okay. The tension between them remained, but something about the conversation had shifted the air. Nathaniel had spent years controlling every aspect of his life. But Serena wasn't something he could control. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. The first public event as husband and wife was a gala for Whitmore Enterprises. The moment they stepped onto the red carpet, cameras flashed in rapid succession, reporters calling out their names. Nathaniel placed a hand on the small of Serena's back, guiding her forward. She stiffened slightly at the touch before relaxing into it, her expression composed. They moved through the crowd effortlessly, stopping only when necessary. Nathaniel's years of experience in the public eye made the act seamless, but Serena surprised him. She was poised, graceful, answering questions with a natural warmth that made it easy to believe they were truly in love. She played the part well, too well. As the evening wore on, Nathaniel found himself watching her more than he should. The way she laughed at a comment from one of the executives. The way she instinctively reached for his arm when someone asked about their honeymoon. It was all an act, and yet it didn't feel like one. As the night neared its end, they stood near the balcony, away from the cameras. The city lights stretched out below them, flickering against the dark sky. Serena leaned against the railing, her expression unreadable. Does it ever get easier? He glanced at her. What? Pretending. Nathaniel hesitated before answering. You tell me. She met his gaze, something flickering behind her eyes. It feels real sometimes. His pulse kicked up at the admission. She looked away, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Maybe that's dangerous. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice lower now. Maybe. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them thickened, charged with something unspoken. Then, without thinking, Nathaniel reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a small touch, fleeting, but the effect was immediate. Serena inhaled sharply, her gaze snapping back to his. He should have pulled away. He should have reminded himself that this was nothing more than a business arrangement. But then she whispered, Nathaniel. And suddenly, pretending didn't feel like an option anymore. Nathaniel hadn't planned on falling. He had intended to keep his distance, to treat this arrangement with the same detachment he applied to every business deal. But as he sat across from Serena at a candlelit dinner in their penthouse, watching the way the soft glow of the flames flickered against her skin, he knew he had lost all sense of control. She was laughing genuine, unguarded. It wasn't the polite, measured laughter she gave during public appearances, nor the hesitant smiles she had offered in their first days together. This was different. This was her letting him in. Something deep in his chest tightened. Serena rested her elbow on the table, swirling the wine in her glass, her gaze meeting his. You're staring, Nathaniel smirked, but he didn't look away. Maybe I like what I see. A hint of pink crept up her neck, but she didn't shy away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with a curiosity that made his pulse quicken. You know, I've been trying to figure you out. He arched a brow. And she took a slow sip of her wine before answering. You act like you have everything under control, like nothing rattles you. But I don't think that's true. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, intrigued. What do you think is true? Serena considered him for a moment before saying softly, I think you care more than you let on. The words landed like a weight against his ribs. He had spent years building walls, ensuring no one got close enough to see past them. And yet, in a matter of weeks, Serena had managed to slip through the cracks. Nathaniel set his glass down, his fingers tightening around the stem. And what about you? What's the truth about Serena Kensington? Her smile faltered just for a second before she masked it with another sip of wine. I think I'm still figuring that out. He wanted to press, to push past whatever hesitation lingered beneath her words, but he knew better than to force it. Instead, he reached across the table, sliding his fingers over hers. She didn't pull away. The air between them shifted, thick with something unspoken. Nathaniel's voice dropped lower. "You don't have to figure it out alone." Serena's breath hitched. For a long, fragile moment, they simply sat there, fingertips grazing, hearts pounding. And then she whispered, "Nathaniel." Something inside him snapped. He stood, pulling her up with him, his hands framing her waist as he guided her toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The skyline stretched out before them, but Nathaniel couldn't focus on anything except the woman in front of him. Serena's hands rested lightly against his chest, her touch hesitant but warm. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she murmured. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her skin. "What wasn't?" she swallowed, her gaze searching his. "Us." Nathaniel's grip tightened on her waist. "Maybe it was." She exhaled shakily, her fingers fisting the fabric of his shirt. "What are we doing?" He didn't have an answer, not one that made logical sense anyway. But for the first time in his life, logic didn't matter. Nathaniel cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Falling." Serena's lips parted, but before she could respond, he closed the distance between them. The kiss was slow, deliberate, a confession in itself. She melted against him, her hands sliding up to his shoulders as she deepened the kiss, as if she had been waiting for this as long as he had. The world outside blurred, the city lights fading into nothing as he lost himself in her. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Serena rested her forehead against his. "This changes everything." Nathaniel smiled against her skin. "I know." And for the first time since this arrangement began, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Nathaniel didn't know when the game had changed, only that it had. The moment he kissed Serena by the window, everything shifted. The arrangement no longer felt like an obligation, but something alive, something real. And that terrified him. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual, the city still quiet beneath the soft hues of dawn. Serena was still asleep, her breathing steady, her body curled in the sheets. He stood at the edge of the bed, watching her for a moment longer than he should have. He had told himself he wouldn't get attached, that this was a business move, nothing more. But as he watched the way her dark lashes fluttered slightly against her cheek, the way she shifted in sleep, unconsciously reaching for the warmth he had left behind, he realized with startling clarity he had already lost the battle. Nathaniel forced himself to move, walking to the balcony, gripping the railing as the crisp morning air hit him. He had built his entire life around control, around ensuring nothing and no one could affect him. But Serena had slipped through the cracks, worming her way into his carefully constructed world, and now he couldn't imagine it without her. The sound of soft footsteps behind him made him turn. Serena stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of his shirts, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. Her hair was still tousled from sleep, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak right away, simply watching him with those deep hazel eyes that always seemed to strip him bare. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You should still be asleep." Serena moved forward, stopping beside him at the railing. "Couldn't." They stood there in silence, the city stretching before them, both aware that the ground beneath them had shifted and there was no turning back. Then, without warning, she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. Nathaniel stiffened for only a second before tightening his grip. Neither of them had to say it. They both knew. Something new had begun. Nathaniel had never been one for distractions. But Serena was becoming one in the best and worst way possible. At work, he found himself glancing at his phone more than usual, half expecting a message from her. When he was in meetings, his mind drifted to the way she had looked that morning, wrapped in his shirt, standing beside him like she belonged there. It was unsettling. And yet, he didn't want it to stop. At the end of the day, he arrived home earlier than expected, pushing open the penthouse door to find Serena sitting on the couch, reading. The sight was so domestic, so natural that it took him by surprise. She looked up, her expression shifting into something warm. "You're home early." Nathaniel loosened his tie, stepping inside. "Thought I'd surprise you." Serena closed her book, tilting her head slightly. "Is that what this is now, surprises?" He smirked, tossing his jacket onto the chair. "You tell me." She didn't answer right away, simply watching him with that quiet intensity that always made his pulse quicken. Then, after a moment, she stood, walking toward him. When she stopped in front of him, she reached up, brushing her fingers lightly against his collar. "You look tired," Nathaniel swallowed. "Long day." Serena's touch lingered, her fingers moving slightly lower, resting against his chest. "You should let yourself breathe, Nathaniel." He exhaled, closing his eyes briefly at the warmth of her touch. "That's not something I'm particularly good at." Serena's lips curved slightly, and before he could think twice, she rose onto her toes, pressing a soft kiss to his jaw. The simple gesture unraveled something deep inside him. Without thinking, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer. She let out a quiet breath, her hands resting against his shoulders. They stayed like that for a moment, the world outside fading. Then, Serena whispered, "I think we're in trouble." Nathaniel let out a low chuckle, brushing his lips against her temple. "I think you're right." But for once in his life, trouble didn't seem so bad. The realization that he was in love with her hit him in the middle of a business dinner. One of his investors was speaking, discussing projections and market strategies, but Nathaniel wasn't listening. Not really. His mind was elsewhere on Serena, on the way her laughter had lingered in his ears that morning, on the way she had looked at him like he was more than just a businessman, more than just a deal. He had never been in love before, he had never allowed himself to be. But now, sitting at a table filled with powerful executives, he realized with startling clarity he didn't just care for Serena. He loved her, and that terrified him more than anything, because love was unpredictable, love was dangerous. Love meant giving someone the power to destroy you. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he cared. When he got home that night, Serena was waiting for him. She stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Nathaniel hesitated in the doorway, his heart pounding. She didn't speak right away, simply watching him, and then, after a long moment, she said, "You're different." He exhaled, stepping closer. "Maybe," Serena tilted her head slightly, searching his face. "Are you scared?" Nathaniel let out a low breath, running a hand through his hair. "Terrified?" Serena took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. "Me too." He reached for her, cupping her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "Tell me to stop and I will." She didn't. Instead, she leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, pressing her lips against his, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the deal, not the arrangement, just them, just this. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Whitmore let himself fall. Nathaniel had never been a man who second-guessed his decisions. His entire career, his entire life, had been built on precision and control. But as he stood in the dimly lit penthouse, watching Serena as she moved through their shared space with an ease that had become second nature, he felt something dangerously close to uncertainty. Not because he didn't want her. No, that much was undeniable, but because he didn't know if wanting her was enough. Serena was different now, more at ease, yet more guarded in ways that unsettled him. She no longer hesitated when she reached for him, no longer second-guessed the moments when their hands brushed, their gazes lingered. But there was something in her eyes, a hesitation that hadn't been there before, and he had a sinking feeling he knew why. Nathaniel had been careful, too careful. He had let himself fall, but he had never said it, never voiced the one thing that had been clawing at his chest for weeks. Serena had given him everything: her trust, her presence, her warmth. And he had taken it greedily, consumed by the way she fit into his life so seamlessly. But he had never told her the truth, that he loved her. She had to know, didn't she? Surely she could see it in the way he looked at her, in the way he reached for her without thinking, in the way he found himself unable to sleep unless she was beside him. But some things needed to be said, and he was running out of time. Serena stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared out at the city. The soft glow of the skyline cast shadows across her face, and for the first time in a long time she looked lost. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice low. "You're thinking about leaving?" She didn't flinch, didn't try to deny it. She just closed her eyes briefly before turning to face him. "I don't know what I'm doing, Nathaniel," she murmured. "I don't know what we are anymore." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had assumed she felt the same way he did, that their unspoken understanding was enough. But now, standing here, he realized how foolish he had been. This wasn't a business deal. This wasn't something he could negotiate into existence. This was love. And love required more than silence. Nathaniel took a step closer, his hands settling on her arms, his touch firm but gentle. "Serena, look at me." She did, her hazel eyes searching his face for something in answer, a reassurance. "I love you," he said, the words rough, unpracticed. "I should have said it sooner. I should have told you the moment I knew." Serena's breath hitched, her fingers curling against his chest as if steadying herself. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "This started as something else, I know that, but it became real, Serena. You became real, and I don't want a life without you in it." Her lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time since meeting her, Nathaniel felt truly vulnerable. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "Say it again." His heart pounded. "I love you." A slow, radiant smile spread across her lips, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite name, but it was enough. And then she was kissing him, her hands fisting his shirt, her body pressing against his like she never wanted to let go. Nathaniel wrapped his arms around her, lifting her slightly off the ground, pouring everything he had into the kiss, every unspoken word, every hesitation, every fear. When they finally broke apart, Serena rested her forehead against his. "I love you too," she whispered. Nathaniel let out a shaky breath, his grip tightening around her. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the future, about strategies, about control. For the first time, he was simply here, with her, and it was everything. The months that followed were a blur of soft mornings and quiet laughter, of stolen moments in between business meetings and public appearances. The world still watched them, still whispered about their marriage, but none of it mattered anymore, because it was real now. Nathaniel no longer cared about the deal, about the company's expectations, about the carefully crafted image they had once maintained. All he cared about was her. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop of their penthouse, watching the sun dip below the skyline, Nathaniel reached into his pocket, his fingers curling around the small velvet box. Serena turned to him, a soft smile on her lips. "What?" He took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee. Serena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "This marriage started as something else," he said, his voice steady, certain, "but I want to do it right. I want to marry you because I love you. Because I can't imagine a life without you." He opened the box, revealing a ring simple, elegant, perfect. Serena's eyes filled with tears, her breath coming in uneven gasps. Nathaniel took her hand. "Marry me for real this time." A choked laugh escaped her, and then she was nodding, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes." Nathaniel stood, slipping the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go, because he wouldn't. Not now, not ever. And as the city lights flickered around them, as the world faded into the background, Nathaniel knew this was the only deal that had ever truly mattered. And he had just won everything.